Hey, good afternoon. My name is John Zook. I'm a Winfield United agronomist covering southern Minnesota, and I'm here today with UFC doing a live broadcast. Today, what I wanted to talk about a little bit, so if you're out there listening, I want to make this totally and completely interactive, but I do have a little bit of an agenda. So I was going to cover a little bit of a crop update as far as frost, where that's at, some planting date issues, what we're seeing there. And then also, what can you do to this 2020 crop to make it better? So maybe some items of what I'm seeing, what we can have out there to make it better. And so I'll kind of walk through that. But to get started, I think what I really wanted to show was a corn plant and go through some of the parts just so you're aware of what's going on physiologically. And then you might have an opportunity to say, okay, here's what I'm finding. What can I do about it? Okay. So I brought in a couple corn plants from the field. So here you can see I'm holding up a corn plant right now. And you can see that I'm trying to highlight the root system here. So look at that root system. And the one thing, if you can see, I'll point to it with my knife, is there's a seed right here. So you can find that seed. And if you're digging up a corn plant, I want you to find that seed. And the first thing that you're going to want to look at health of that corn plant, is you're going to look at this radicle. Okay, so you're going to look at the radical root, and that radical root is this one right here that you can see going out. It's going to be the root that comes out of the tip of the seed. And so look at that radical, make sure that it's nice and white, all the root hairs are intact. That's going to be any indication of any kind of stresses or any kind of insect feeding. Next, go to the mesocaudal. So the mesocaudal, if I point to it right here, is this bigger white piece. That mesocaudal is really important, especially now before that corn plant gets up and out of the ground, because that would be the umbilical cord or the equivalent of an umbilical cord connecting the nutrients that are in that seed to that growing point of that corn plant. So making sure that I always say making sure that that mesocaudal is nice, crisp, white, kind of an apple crunch to it. So when you squeeze it, you can hear it crunch and it feels crunchy like an apple. That's going to be a good indicator of a nice, healthy mesocaudal. And that's going to lead you right to the growing point where that mesocaudal interacts with those roots. So as the roots get, as you can see, the secondary root system coming together, now you're going to see that that growing point is going to be found right at the base of where my knife is pointing here. Okay. So what you would want to do then is say, okay, if I found the growing point, what does that growing point look like? So I cut one open, I dissected a plant, and here you can see that I split that plant open, and I'm going to bend it back a little bit so you can see that growing point. And where that growing point is right here. So you can see that growing point, the tip of my knife, if I bend it down a little bit. So that growing point is right where that mesocaudal, so the mesocaudal here comes up, meets the secondary roots, and right here you can see that growing point. Now you want to inspect that growing point for any discoloration. Okay, that's the main thing you're looking for. You want it could be a little yellow, but if it's brown or any kind of black, maybe specks discoloration, that would be a sign of an unhealthy stressed corn plant. And that becomes really important just trying to diagnose early season symptoms. Okay, so all the corn, the two plants I've shown you here so far today were planted on April 27th. Okay, so that earlier frame of planting, but definitely not the earliest stuff. And from what I can see, for the most part, it's staged at about V3 pushing 4. Okay, so we're going to count that first rounded tip leaf. Then we go V1, or so V1 rounded tip leaf, V2, V3 pushing 4 is where this would be. So I grabbed this plant, I kind of cheated. I picked a good looking plant, right? So I had something to show you what it looked like. But we do have some uneven emergence there, okay? Meaning, if I got this plant came right next to each other, I got a V4 plant, V3 plant pushing 4 with a V2 plant pushing 3 right next to each other, okay? So it's not more than 2 leaf colors behind, but they're definitely behind. Some of those early plantings did have some uneven emergence. From what I'm seeing out there in answer plots so far, is any kind of starter effects are definitely playing the odds there on making a more consistent, more even emergence overall. And when I say starter, I think about a liquid pop-up starter. We try to run several tests where we're testing different starters, different rates in the answer plots, and we always try to partner that with a zinc type of product. Okay, so talk a little bit about a zinc product, but first I want to go back to looking at that growing point. So what are some things you can do? We learned about the plants as far as that seed and making sure that that seed's intact. And if you squeeze the seed, make sure that it's not mushy. Looking at the Meza Caudal and making sure that that's nice and crisp. Now, what can you do if you got issues there? The biggest thing that you might be able to see an advantage of is using a foliar application of potentially a fungicide. Okay, typically we want to put a fungicide on not quite yet, but around that V4, V5, 6, 7 timeframe. So here in the next couple of weeks is probably when we'll target that on most of that earlier planted crop. And that when I find that growing point is discolored, that tends to be the best time that I can get a response to the fungicide. So if I was going to say, hey, should I or shouldn't I do it earlier fungicide? Because that's a really common question I get. A lot of people go, hey, tassel fungicide, I can look at hybrid response and see those issues. But how do I know if I do an earlier fungicide? That would be a key indicator. Check out the growing point and look at the health of that root system because that would be a key indicator to get the best response you can for a fungicide. Okay, so if you were going to do that, or if you're looking for areas to make that application happen and get a return on investment, that would probably be the best place to put it to get that response. Again, the next thing, as I alluded to with those zinc applications, and I want to show you what a zinc deficiency looks like because I do get the question a lot with zinc deficiency. So here's that same corn plant that I showed you that was B3 pushing 4. Again, here's another corn plant. It's a little further behind, again, from the same field, same planting date. But what I want you to look at is if you look down the whorl, you can almost perfectly see the discoloration of that yellowing effect. Now, I purposely cherry picked the plant just to show you what it looks like. A lot of times if we are seeing visual symptoms, the theory is, hey, a lot of yield has already been lost. So we want to fix it before we see the visual symptoms. But this would be probably, this yellow plant here in my left hand would be a key indicator of probably some phosphorus and zinc deficiency early season. Now it's really hard to tell the difference of sulfur, nitrogen, slash wet feet slash zinc deficiency early season. But I cherry picked this plant and I found it in a plot where I know that we tried to limit those applications of zinc so we could see what that looks like early. So now you can kind of see what you look like early. One thing that I would say is if you had an entire field of these plants right here, it probably would look good. It would look just fine. But really, comparison is the thief of joy. And so if you have something to compare it to, that's where we start to see the differences. And then this leads me to, well, okay, if I have this kind of looking crop, what do you really need? Well, mainly what I can say here is we probably need a few days of sunshine and 70 or 80, we'll take it. And most of these symptoms will go away. The one thing to highlight here too, other than that yellowing, is you might be able to see a little bit of a purple midrib. So again, phosphorus deficiency. So those early season nutrient deficiencies on that plant. And we got to remember that phosphorus and zinc are both immobile in the soil. And so that's why we would put them in the starter application and try to get them right in furrow. So when that seed germinates, it imbibes moisture and it gets that drink of phos and zinc to help it pop up. Okay. The other thing with zinc is it's not only immobile in the soil, but it's also immobile in the plant. So what you'll see with the zinc deficiency, and if you look at this plant again, is you can see that the cotyledon leaf is pretty green. You can see the next leaf up is getting more yellow, and then you can see that there's more deficiency here on the top part of the plant. So as you go up in the plant, you see some more yellowing and deficiency there. And as that plant grows out of it, you're going to see that'll you'll see a lot of deficiencies on the top, whereas it'll be green and down on the bottom. And that's an indicator again that zinc is not mobile in the plant. But you go, okay, great. I saw zinc deficiency. Um, I can scout for it. I put zinc in fertile. Why am I still being zinc deficient? It's probably because we have cool, wet soils and we need to have those roots start exploring that soil so they can grab those nutrients you put out. One thing that we try to do at Winfield United and that I've been doing for a couple of years now, a few years in the answer plot, 6 going on 7, is doing tissue tests. And sometimes the early tissue test isn't as great. So if you're going to tissue test a plant this size, we would recommend taking the entire plant. Once we get to V5, we'd want to take the uppermost collared leaf, and that's where we start to make decisions of, well, what deficiencies are you seeing, and what nutrients or applications can we make to get a good return on investment. One of the pieces of information that we find is that of those V5 to V8 tissue samples, 87 plus percent of them, um, plus or minus, are showing up zinc deficient. Okay, so early on, we're seeing that zinc deficiency occur. And then, so I always go, well, what does zinc do in the plant? And what zinc does in the plant is zinc is what I call the forklift of the plant. So zinc is going to take all the nutrients as you go into grand growth stage. So your corn plant's going to germinate. It'll put on some leaf collars. Once you get to V6, V7, you're going to go into grand growth. You're going to start the uptake of nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, all the components that you need to make protein, sugars, and starches to turn that plant into an ear. Okay. What I want to see is how much zinc I can have to put and pack those nutrients in. Okay, so that's an example of zinc. Um, because I'm live here, I want to take a minute. I've talked for 10 minutes now. Are there any questions on zinc or some of the parts of a corn plant on what you might see? I know there's maybe a few of you watching out there, but if there are questions, type them in there and I can stop and answer them. I know I said I have an agenda, but I didn't really take time to slow down and let those questions feed in. So don't be afraid to ask for questions. I'll stop what I'm doing and answer it at that point. Okay. So going back to the conversation of that grand growth is zinc is the forklift. It's going to take everything off of that elevator as it comes up into the corn plant and then drive it and pack it into the cells. Okay. And the more zinc you have, what we find with the tissue samples is typically locally, I can see that I can get more phosphorus in, I can get more nitrogen in, more sulfur in just by having more zinc. It's not that I applied more nutrients, I just had the zinc sufficiency to the level that it needed to be in the plant. So starting and taking a tissue sample, again, 87% of the time is typically what I see on average here in Minnesota being deficient at that point, but it really depends on how you make those applications of zinc. A couple other nutrients that I wanted to hit on were nitrogen, sulfur, and then of course potassium. So I go N, K, S, zinc are kind of my big four when I think about nutrient management in corn. I gave you a little bit of a story about zinc, but let's talk about nitrogen and sulfur. Okay, so most of the time, nitrogen and sulfur I might consider are fairly easy nutrients because they're mobile in the soil. And so we can apply them just about any time of the season as long as we can get them down in the roots and get them uptaken. There's certain times and places that you want to use like a nitrogen stabilizer to get that nitrogen released later in the season or to make sure it doesn't escape by volatilization or leaching. But in most cases, they're fairly easy to manage. But what we always forget with nitrogen and sulfur is they go hand in hand. So if you're putting nitrogen down, you have to have sulfur with it, or you should have sulfur with it, because it definitely makes that nitrogen application a lot more efficient. Okay. And what I mean by efficient is nitrate is taken up by the plant and that's mobile. It's moved up through the plant by potassium and it moves up through the plant and puts it up at that growing point in the plant. So nitrogen's dropped off, potassium goes back down and feeds the roots with byproducts of photosynthesis. When you put that nitrogen up at that growing point, it's in the nitrate form, it's in that mobile form, but we have to convert it by a process called nitrate metabolism. The plant has to convert it by nitrate metabolism, and that process takes sulfur. So you can have as much nitrogen as you want in the soil. If you're not partnering it with sulfur, you're going to have a slow nitrogen metabolism, and that's going to slowly convert that nitrogen level and slow down the growth of your plant. Now, there's no denying that some of this yellowing could again be nitrogen sulfur deficiencies. It's a little too early to tell, but if you are seeing yellowing this time of year, those would be the three: nitrogen, sulfur, and or zinc with a lot of this. Because I see phosphorus along with it, that's what kind of leads me to suspect that it's zinc. And plus, I picked it from a plot where I knew that zinc was the limiting factor. Okay, so those are some things that I wanted to cover with the corn plant and go over. I haven't seen any questions here as of yet. So I'll kind of keep going through what else and some other things to look at as far as going through that corn plant. Now, again, I said that we are going to count that rounded tip leaf. We got a V1, V2, V3 leaf. Always try to look at the uppermost leaf collar for any kind of micronutrient deficiencies. So you might see some other deficiencies, but any of the mobile nutrients are going to show up on the bottom part of the plant. So as we get into it, the two nutrients that are the most common uh, deficient in the season that are mobile would be nitrogen and potassium. So we're going to see the firing at the bottom parts of the leaves. And so you look at the top for most micronutrient deficiencies, and then you would look at the bottom for any of those two macronutrient deficiencies, nitrogen and potassium. That would allow you to kind of assess where you're at as far as making those applications. Okay, so I kind of want to slow down here and go back and re-say what I talked about. And so first off, I think you always want to look at the parts of the corn plant to make any decisions. And it's easy if you pluck that corn plant out of the ground, take that seed, look at the mesocaudal, find that growing point. It's going to lead you right to the growing point, okay, right where my finger is here, and cut that growing point open and assess for it. The other thing that I'm just thinking of here that I didn't note is if you really want to get technical with your root health, is all these other roots growing out of that growing point here. So I'll rip the seed off. So you can see this is the primary root system. Here's the seed right here, okay? And the rest, this is the radical root. These are the seminal roots coming off of it. That's the primary root system. That's going to feed that plant about till the V4, V5 timeframe. So about till right now on this corn plant. Now you can see on this corn plant, what's left on here is called the secondary root system, aka nodal roots, and that's going to do the bulk of the nutrient and water uptake for the remainder of the season. Okay, so the remainder of the season, that's where we're going to see that nutrient and water uptake. Okay, so I saw that we just got a question come in here, and the question is, if we add zinc, what kind of response should we expect to get? Okay, so sometimes what we'll see with zinc, and I'll go off of the tissue samples and the studies that we do in the answer plots in response. And what I find is if I can do a tissue sample or I know that I'm zinc deficient, that increases the odds of getting a response. And the response that I've seen from a foliar application of zinc with a tissue sample that says I'm deficient in zinc is close to 5 bushel. 4.9 is typically what I see for that bushel response. And that's a Maxin ZMB product is what I was using there. The next question I think that I got to go over, well, how much? Do you use a quart? Do you use 2 quarts? Is more always better? I think from what I've seen, I've done 1 quart, I've done 2 quarts, I've done 3 quarts. You can always increase the level of zinc, but remember, zinc is immobile in the plant. So you'd almost be better off doing 1 quart and getting it sufficient up to that sufficiency range, and then coming back maybe 4 or 5 leaf collars later and seeing if you are still zinc deficient. And if you are, that would mean another application versus trying to put all 2 or 3 quarts right up front to try to fix it. And then guess what happens? You just grow some more leaves and you're zinc deficient again because the plant can't move it. Oh, the other question here that came in because I was on the nitrogen and sulfur conversation was what ratio do we recommend with top dressing corn? So that's a good question. I think that a lot of times we give ourselves too much credit for the sulfur that's out there. We don't have enough mineralization coming from the fields. We're expecting more than what we get. most of the time as applied, I try to be super aggressive and I try to get down to that probably 8 pounds of nitrogen to 1 pound of sulfur. So an 8-to-1 ratio is what I would start recommending. But I'd always go back to nutrient removal and say, hey, if you did fall anhydrous and you didn't put any fall sulfur down, well, you still are expecting in our area anywhere from 2 to 240, 260 bushel crop. What's the removal of sulfur? And then are you putting on enough sulfur to get that crop? And in some cases, you might have to be more aggressive with that side dress if you hadn't applied sulfur in any other way, shape, or form up until that point. Okay. So sulfur and nitrogen are mobile. If you're putting on nitrogen as side dress, you certainly should have sulfur with it to make sure that you're utilizing that nitrogen efficiently. And then, of course, zinc is what's going to take it in and pack it into those cells. Okay, good questions. Thank you for those. Um, so again, going back to that plant and making sure that you're getting those nutrients that you need into it, and assessing that primary root system. The one thing that I was talking about is every leaf collar that's above ground is going to be connected to a ring of nodal roots below ground. And I know it's really hard to see on the camera here, but you can see I got 3 leaf collars above ground. And if you actually look to see, there's actually 3 rings of roots here. So I'm pulling down these 3 rings, are these 3 roots, and these roots are number 2, and the leftovers here are number 3. So if you really wanted to see how well your plant is doing below ground compared to how well it looks above ground, this is a great looking corn plant. But if I dug it down and I only saw, oh, I only had 2 rings of nodal roots and I had 3 leaf collars above ground, that means that it's a little farther behind in root development than what we would want or expect it to be at this time. So for every leaf collar, you want to be able to see a ring of nodal roots. So don't be afraid to dig up your corn plant and look for that ring of nodal roots. And that'll kind of give you an indication of how those roots are developing underground. One last thing that I might add, and these roots look fairly good, but from what I'm seeing out there, planting conditions across the area were relatively good, uh, and good in comparison to the last 2 years that we've had to deal with. So probably great if you compare it to the last 2 years, but in general, I still think those sub 2, 3 inches below the planting seed bed. So if you plant in the top 3 inches, I'm talking inches 3 through 6 down below that. We're still we're still a little moist, and I am finding some compaction out there. So the next thing is going to be, okay, well, how are my roots going to go through it? And I think that's going to be up to Mother Nature if we stay moist or how we dry out, that sort of thing. Okay, so yep, maybe this came from your field, very well could have, or it came from your neighbor's field, right? So I always use that, especially when I'm talking about poor weed control, which I've seen plenty of that out there this year. I'm always looking from corn or at corn in your neighbor's field, okay? But if it's good, which I don't get a lot of those phone calls, by the way, come look at my corn, it looks pretty cool. Most of the time I get the phone calls of, hey, come look at my corn because there's something wrong with it. So I always use it came from your neighbor's field, but in this case, it might have came from your field, Ryan. Just one quick note here before I tie it up. Uh, Feel free to make those applications. I tried to concentrate on what you could do now versus what that corn plant is thinking now. We'll try to stay posted and come to some answer plots events later in the season, and we'll talk a little bit through some of the next step of applications that we can make um, going forward and what we can look at. Uh, Another question that came in, and again, kind of want to keep this to 30 minutes, so I'll take a few more if you wanted to write them in to answer this. But what steps would you take to determine if you need more nitrogen in? Good question. Those are some steps that I probably skipped over, but the first thing that I would do is make sure where that nitrogen is at in the soil. So I like to go and say, hey, can I take a soil test for nitrogen? And that'll give me nitrate and ammonia. That's not always an easy thing to do, and it's really hard to tackle that. So then you go back to when do you apply the nitrogen and maybe what rainfall you had. Okay, can you time that with rainfall? Because then it might give you an idea Well, I put my nitrogen on, it was stabilized, yes or no, and I had this much rain. Where is it at in the soil profile? Kind of the thing that's been really working for me though, because again, that kind of introduces a lot more questions. Thing that's been really working for me is using the field forecasting tool, or in combination with some other practices that I hear from the countryside, like nitrate, common nitrate test, tissue nitrogen, those sorts of things. Kind of putting it all together and using a model to say, hey, here's where your nitrogen is. This is how much your plant needs day to day, and this is how much you should put down, or this is how much you'll. This is how far into the season you'll make it. So I think some of these forecasting tools or models. The one that I use that I like is the field forecasting tool. Really help kind of make that decision or build confidence in your decision as far as what you should put down and how much you should have there. So you can always turn to that to help answer the questions. And anybody at UFC would certainly be able to help you answer that. Okay, so I don't see any more questions now. And so I'm going to kind of wrap it up. You can always feel free to reach out to me, or anyone else at UFC here to answer any of your questions. And we'll try to get them taken care of for you. So thanks for watching. Thanks for participating. And again, please come to our answer plot sessions here later in the year to learn more, or stay tuned with any of these updates. If you get something out of this video, just please like it, send it, chat it, talk about it. We definitely want to do more of these things, but it's going to be try to be dependent upon what kind of interaction we get and the feedback. So appreciate your time, and thanks for participating.